So hello everyone, and thank you who have been coming back after lunch and joining us for this afternoon session. So my name is Christin Heamagi, and I represent Maritime Archaeology. So for you who do not know, we're the trading arm of Maritime Archaeology Trust based in Southampton. So I have over the last 15 years worked across a number of different types of developments, from pipe outlines, dredging projects, offshore renewables, and research-led diving projects as well. And today I just wanted to look at how far we have come since 2019. And I want to highlight one of these quotes. We had them on the slide earlier as well, both from Rachel and Alison. But this one I chose to focus on. So this was UVic, and you said this in 2019, and it's an apologetic comment there as well. I think that's really important to bring out and kind of be, oh, sorry, maybe go that way or this way, but that's something if we all try to keep it in mind during my presentation, and then we can discuss it afterwards as well. So today I'll focus on kind of offshore developments from the point of view of an archaeological consultant. So I'll aim to show you how archaeology is intertwined and should be intertwined with the whole project, from early, even pre-scoping to post-consent, and through to post-construction monitoring and into decommissioning as well. So 2019 is not that long ago, but still it was a bit of a different world. And what I like to really use in this example that it was before COVID and before pandemic lockdowns. So the pandemic itself didn't stop archaeological involvement with the projects, but it changed the way we work. So more out of the need to adapt than anything. So my example is the toolbox talks, or protocol for archaeological discoveries talks, or archaeological briefings. So this is something that the project archaeologist provides to the client, the developer, or to a campaign that goes out and has eyes on the seabed, we often call it. So that's when there's a risk or maybe a chance to discover archaeological objects. And before the pandemic and around 2019, this was held in person. Most of these were held in person, and I must say I was really against holding it over the phone because Teams wasn't really established. It was just coming in there. I was against holding it in person. I was against providing like a short video as well, because I thought you really need that engagement and you can't do it online. With Teams coming in, with the need to actually stay at home and not go out, we had to adopt our way of doing this, and we started doing it over Teams. We produce videos as well. So that's how most of those talks are. They're still ongoing. They're a really good way of engaging the developer and the different campaigns, but now we do it over Teams, still live, with videos sometimes when there's low impact, or with an archaeologist if they are on site anyway. I think this is better for the environment, better for the individual, and it's cost saving for the developer as well, while it's still engaging very much so. And I'm not saying that Great Yarmouth isn't great. Of course it is. So what is better now? My opinion is that it's the understanding for the need of early archaeological involvement. It has increased since 2019. It's increased across the whole industry, and I think on a middle to high management level as well. And it gets communicated frequently down to on-site contractors, like the toolbox talks, through meetings. And it has been a relatively quick change, probably not as recent 2019, but together with us being more visible and the curatorial support we are receiving as well in most areas, with regular meetings. And I think that really helps, that projects are keen to set up a bi-monthly or a monthly meeting where you talk through the next steps, what you've done so far, and kind of updating the developer throughout the process as well. So another example is kind of geotechnical and geoarchaeological investigations, and we've heard a lot about it this morning as well. I think that's really great. But how to combine geotechnical and geoarchaeology, or to separate them. So something Rachel said, that she used cores that had been retained for a long time, and you can see on the slide there that that's a core that has been split. So you have half retained, you got the whole core there, fiber core. What used to be the case was that half was retained and we could use that for archaeological purposes, while half of it was used for geotechnical sampling and testing. But since around 2019, most of the British labs have started running out of space. And that means that a lot of this material is now collected in fiber cores. It's logged in their labs, it's photographed, but then it's bagged. So it's put in a bag and you lose the high resolution ability from that. Then you lose, you disrupt the sample, you lose vital information, and you can't really grab the opportunity to go and visit these cores later. So what do we do about that? We've been discussing with the developers, of course, how we can get involved in a different way. What we've seen is that they're more keen and open to undertaking archaeology specific cores with a research question tied to them, which is actually what the guidance published in 2011 already suggested. So it seems like we've done a whole circle around and come back to let's focus our cores and our research questions in the areas where we need them. Mitigation and archaeological involvement. So not everyone on the call are used to working in the offshore industry or know so much about development-led archaeology, but in terms of mitigation of impact, that's often our first steps when it comes to archaeological involvement. So the developer wants to know if we think there will be impact. And if the answer is yes, which it of course is in most cases, what can they do about it? What can they do to avoid the impact, and how expensive will it be? So the answer should be easy, of course. So to avoid the impact, you avoid directly or indirectly impacting the archaeology with vessels, anchors, or construction. Design around it. Sounds pretty easy, but to be able to avoid it, we need to know where the archaeology is. And that's why archaeological assessment of geophysical data plays such a fundamental role in the process. And that's in combination with desk-based research and communication with stakeholders, curators, and development through all project stages. And in terms of geophysical data assessments, it's really great that since the last conference, we have updated guidance commissioned by Historic England and produced by MSDS Marine. And maybe Mark will mention this or talk about it more in a minute as well. So I think it's really important that we know what to advise, that we have consistency across consultancies, and we have the documents to rely on if we get a pushback from the developers or questions. So we as archaeologists must also make sure that we request or even demand more than just geophysical survey. And this is especially during the post-consent or pre-construction campaigns, where the risk of impact to archaeological receptors is not as high on the lovely visible wrecks that we found in the geophysical data or by doing research. It's on the unknown that we might call anomalies. So we can either avoid everything and we end up creating a design nightmare for development, or we can investigate more to ensure that we get past the kind of Schrödinger's archaeology state where we don't know if something's archaeology until we look. So I covered an example of this in the case study I'll mention in a little bit. But bringing back to what Peter and Ali was talking about as well. So who is an archaeologist? I mentioned toolbox talks, and I completely agree with both with Alison and Peter and everyone who discussed skills gap, and this is not what I mention here. But when we use the toolbox talk as an example of how we engage with developers, toolbox talks and archaeological briefings is very important. It creates a positive atmosphere and it helps really outlining why we're there and what we're doing. And it doesn't have to be only to someone with eyes on the seabed. It can be throughout the whole chain of communication at the developers. But I think it's important to highlight during these talks and also in a discussion with each other that because you've sat through one of these talks, we're not expecting anyone to be an archaeologist or to do our job. So we're not adding something to their already agreed work scope. It might be self-explanatory when I say it like this. Of course, one presentation does not an archaeologist make, but there is a risk that people might think that this is the end of archaeological involvement. Now we're going to use the protocol for archaeological discoveries. Well, most of you are probably familiar with it. So now we don't need the archaeologists anymore. Or there has been cases where I have received data that's been assessed by someone with archaeological training, or it's just called archaeological targets, and there's no way of tracing those back to someone who's an archaeologist or an archaeological consultancy. And I do suspect that it might have derived from someone who's received a pad talk, clicked archaeology on a couple of anomalies, and that point data has then made its way to me. So another discussion is if the developers themselves, can they cover archaeology in their constrained talk without us being present? And I think if they refer to us, should anything be found, if there's no expected seabed impact, and if it's for information purposes and not a condition of their consent, then I would be willing to agree. We also know it helps to have a good, friendly relationship with the developers, but that's often a result of working together over a long time and a number of projects. And it depends partly on individuals to appreciate the value of our heritage. And you can, of course, in guidance state that clear lines of communication must be established. But it's very hard to regulate that people must have a positive working relationship. But what we do know, and I think everyone on the call would agree with me who work with development-led archaeology, is that where we have an engaged and proactive developer, we end up with better archaeological results. And that's both in terms of avoiding impact and increasing our knowledge about our heritage. So what do we need to improve on? Of course, we're not perfect yet. Sharing information, as discussed, taken at the flood event last week, and CIfA in Belgium last month. How do we get past that developers need to protect their commercially sensitive information while sharing it with the archaeological community, but we're also in commercially competition with each other? The National Marine Heritage Record for England, as have been presented, and the Marine Data Exchange Heritage Accelerator project are really great steps towards that. I'm not going to talk more about it here, and we can discuss it later. We should talk about how unplanned impact, when it has occurred, because it does happen that we impact archaeological receptors. It could be when they were not found in initial surveys, so they don't have an exclusion zone, when the receptor is mistaken for something else, maybe an unexploded ordnance, or if there has been a communication breakdown or other errors between work packages, for example. But do we as a group, and let's discuss later as well, do we think it's reasonable to recognize the impact has occurred on one receptor? So if we use a known wreck, a known shipwreck, we recognize that impact, but we want to offset that impact by investigating a completely different receptors, for example, submerged landscapes. How do we value, how do we compare the two in terms of value and archaeological significance? So that would be really interesting to talk to everyone about. And as mentioned earlier today as well, the evidence review note published by the Crown Estate will be published shortly. And it might not change our methodologies too much, but it may change how we present and discuss results and potential impacts. So to bring this whistle-stop tour back to how we can use initiatives to shape the future, I'll present a case study where I think we did quite well in that. So working with the industry to get the best outcome for the historic environment and the developer, and not solely using avoidance. So this case study focuses on an area in the North Sea, East Anglia, and some of you attending CIfA 8 in Ostend might have seen some of these slides being presented by my colleague Laurie Roberts. So case study looks at a few unknown anomalies, and that's where you see here there's two different targets, and as you can see they were only seen on the MAG. No other data sets. These There we go. This campaign was run in combination with the unexploded ordnance survey, so we had an archaeologist on board at all times. And investigations found a number of items classed as archaeology, but today I'll focus on anchors. So in total, 22 anchors were found, 7 were intact, 13 were broken, and 2 unknown because of concretion. And a methodology to how to safely recover these to deck, so not just avoid them, because they were in an area where impact will occur. They could not be microsited around or designed around. So together with Historic England, as this are English waters, we worked out a methodology how to raise them, record them, both traditionally recording methods and 3D, and then put them back on the seabed, something called a wet storage. They were all put back as close as possible to their initial find spot and not all together in one area. So this method turned out to be quick, efficient, worth the investment, and had the ability to capture huge amounts of information that would have otherwise never been acquired. It's an opportunity to learn something new, not only doing the absolute minimum. And this ties in with Vic's quote from earlier as well. So we can afford to be less apologetic, and we should be. We need to request offshore archaeology assessments and investigation as well. And the regulars and curators need to insist that assessments not only are adequate, but it moves beyond basic requirements. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christin. It's really good to see that example placed in context of the development side of things as well. Already got questions. That's good. No, maybe not. Has anyone else got any questions? Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was really interesting. And your perspectives on access to geotechnical samples, sort of pre-COVID and post-COVID, was interesting because I became a marine geoarch after all that. I was doing the boring terrestrial stuff, so that's interesting to know. And I think I just want to point out or make a point from my perspective that in terms of access to geotechnical samples at geotechnical logging facilities, I've had some sort of really positive experiences with that recently, although I agree that the vibrocore samples are often sort of chopped up for geotechnical testing and do end up in bags. I think that sort of highlights that importance of early engagement with developers and geotechnical units to make sure that we get a kind of timely access to geotechnical logs and the opportunity to go to the geotechnical facilities to record them. And I've had sort of
really important, the timely access, and not give up on that. Definitely keep reminding them. Because as well with developers, it goes through different people being responsible for different parts of it. And when they sign them off for testing, that's it. You really need to be there and show why it's important. And I think these presentations and meetings we do have with the project to show this is actually important, like the data you presented as well. This is why we're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said about, clear research objectives for what you're doing. And I think presenting those to them and making it clear why you want to access them and exactly what you need. It can be difficult because, from my perspective, I don't always understand the sort of minutiae of the geotechnical testing process, and it varies by laboratory, so it can be hard. But yeah, absolutely right. Just keeping in touch with them, early engagement, all that sort of thing, and you can get really positive outcomes from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions specifically to do with Christin, or would we pick anything else up as part of the wider discussion? Okay, so I probably should have said earlier in the day, but Mark actually isn't delivering the next presentation. Unfortunately, he was unable to present today. So, but in his absence, Alistair is going to present on a case study showing how we deal with something which can be even more tricky than shipwrecks, which is aircraft. So I'll pass over to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and apologies for anyone disappointed if they wanted to hear Mark talk on the subject. But hopefully, we're singing off the same hymn sheet, and I like to think he'll agree with most of my points. So the idea of my talk will be to give those less familiar with offshore aircraft crash sites a little bit of an insight into the process involved, and also some of the current ideas that are coming out from sort of academia in terms of investigating aircraft crash sites, particularly, and as intimated earlier, where we do deal with them in the offshore environment, we do tend to be covered by confidentiality with developers. So, what am I going to cover? How do they arrive at their current location? The site formation processes, what might survive, and as you might be surprised to know, significantly more generally survives in the marine environment than in terrestrial environments when it comes to aircraft crash sites. And then a rather well-known case study, but hopefully it will give some idea of the work involved and some of the constraints that we have to work with on the subject of aircraft. So, using methodologies adapted from terrestrial research, looking at sequence of events and post-depositional process, we have three elements to understand. These comprise of what caused the initial failure of the aircraft, how it impacted with water, and what has occurred to it since that event. And these combine in order to make every situation unique. In answering these, we also consider whether elements of the aircraft remained at the surface at any time for any length of time after the impact, what damage from the impact occurred to the different elements of the aircraft, the sea state and weather conditions, and whether these contributed to the state of the aircraft, both in terms of how it broke up at the surface, or how long it stayed at the surface, and therefore what state it was as it sunk. The effects of local currents on the remains both at the surface and at depth. It's surprising how hydrodynamic aircraft remains are, and we find significant numbers of small parts that are unrelated to anything else simply by the way they've moved across the seabed or within the water column. The buoyancy of the different elements of the aircraft, again, this impacts how it arrives at the seabed, and how these might have altered the depositional process in terms of items sinking and being buried quicker, or whether items stay above the seabed surface. And then whether they were contemporary salvage attempts and what their impact was on the wreck. And this also is in terms of aircrew salvage attempts in order to recover things to help with their survival. Not so much in the North Sea and the English Channel, but certainly in sites in the Pacific and Indo-Pacific, where there are cases of aircrews having spent significant time in the water and having better survival chances due to the warmer waters. Aircraft within the marine and tidal and inland lakes and bodies of water tend to be more intact, as I said. If you've ever read the HE document on aircraft crash sites, we're talking less than 2% in terrestrial sites, I believe is the quoted figure. And as you'll see from our case study, and for those who've worked on CIfA or SIN sites, we tend to get a good 40, 50, 60% of the original aircraft, depending on how it crashed. Moving forward from that initial process, we then do need to consider those environmental impacts. Shallow water sites tend to struggle to survive as well as deeper water sites. And also it depends on the interaction with souvenir hunters, industrial impacts from fishing. There is at least one museum in East Anglia that has an enormous collection of aeroplane engines and propellers and gearboxes. These didn't really start to be collected and appear in collections until sort of the 1960s and 1970s as fishing boats got bigger, and they moved over from to basic plastic-based ropes and gear. Stronger gear, and basically these things started to be pulled off the seabed or pulled out of the wrecks. We then also have commemorative action and memorials and ordnance clearance as potential impacts. So, what has occurred since the initial deposition? This flow diagram featured environmental and cultural factors affecting the submerged aircraft. It takes ideas from Muckleroy, who we're all familiar with from his Marine Archaeology book, along with Gibbs and Ward et al., with some variations proposed by the author Samantha Bell. The major differences in site formation models developed for shipwrecks and for proposed submerged aircrafts are the addition of modern influences. This process on aircraft wreck sites is multifaceted, yet seems essential to recognise as it contributes to our story of the aircraft's wreck and the evolution of its distribution on the seabed. Material subsequently deposited on a site is one example of modern influences that can affect the observed seabed distribution and can be classified as two distinct categories: rubbish and memorial. Rubbish, or material deposited on the site without a particular purpose, is most apparent on sites examined where things like cans, fishing gear, bottles, and other detritus is scattered amongst the wreck assemblage, but are unassociated with the wreck. The second type, and though very unlikely to be encountered in an offshore environment, is memorials found on sites incorporating material from the site assemblage. These items cannot be situated in the same category as rubbish, as their placement on site serves a specific purpose and represents a distinct chapter in the history of the wreck site. Also, and it may be something most of us would not generally consider, is graffiti and how it should be considered as an additional process of modern interaction, which would influence a site. And while in the short term this may be viewed negatively, in the long term it may contribute to the historic significance of our understanding of a site. As I said before, these are very much more for the shallow water and warm water sites where there are diver interactions. But they should be considered particularly as offshore and deeper diving opportunities occurring within the technical diving community and as sites get discovered. One easy way to identify what remains is to have a plan and profile diagram of the aircraft and just shade in the parts as you find them, equally as applicable and would work in using an ROV or in a diving situation. But what we're looking at in terms of the impact of archaeology is the impact on site stability, modification of the site formation processes by our interaction, unwanted and intrusive damage due to a wider awareness of the site, and then the preservation of record as a finite source, as well as potential closure for a family. In terms of doing investigations, taken from the terrestrial world, is the TESTED acronym. T stands for tips, locating the tips of the wings and the empennage, the logic being that if the right wing tip, for example, is with the wreck, it stands to reason the rest of the right wing should be also there. E stands for engines, including propellers and blades. S is for surfaces, locating all the primary and secondary control surfaces. T is for the tail or the empennage. E stands for those external fixtures and fittings, including the landing gear and any external tanks and pods. And D is for doors, including hatches, canopies, and windows. As a theory, it works very well. However, in practice, and knowing how aircraft crash sites occur at sea, we should always be very careful of some of this, as dispersal patterns tend to be slightly different following an impact with the water. The classic example is a lot of American aircraft during the Second World War, in terms of the heavy bombers, would lose their tails on impact with the water due to the shape of the fuselage, whereas British-built bombers like the Lancaster tend to survive that initial impact. So the current approaches, as we are all aware, we tend to try and avoid aircraft at all cost, though they are very ephemeral in the geophysics data. Once they have been identified or they are discovered during the various clearance processes, AEZs are put in place, temporary AEZs are put in place, and then the basics of how we record it is decided. Generally, recording will be that basic photogrammetry modelling or photo modelling, and an in situ monitoring with the use of an AEZ, and potentially then reassessment of AEZs after the project completion. Alternative approaches, and some of this is applicable to the case study that I'm going to use. There's the option to relocate within a project's boundary, again with an AEZ created. Alternatively, there's recovery and retention, or recovery and disposal. The last is probably the most controversial approach, as skipping things that might be related to someone's lost relatives is not going to go down very well in terms of the impact on the reputation of the developer. So my case study is going to be the Solent Barracuda. Though this is a couple of years old, it's one of the few really good examples we have of developer involvement in the recovery of an aircraft. During survey work carried out in preparation for the interconnector project IFA2, the extant remains of the aircraft were discovered at the end of the runway of the former Royal Navy Air Station Daedalus. Following research and talking to the curators at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, we identified it as a ferry barracuda. First, all aluminium, high-winged monoplane in use with the Fleet Air Arm, so quite a significant aircraft, and one of which no complete examples exist. The problem with the aircraft's location was it was right where the interconnector route came ashore, if you can see the little image at the top, and therefore the possibility of micrositing around it, though considered, was not practical, and the cost of rerouting the entire route was again rather impractical. Therefore, the budget was put in place for the aircraft to be recovered. Following research into it, we confirmed, or it was confirmed, that it was unlikely to have had any fatalities in the crash, and therefore a license was applied for under the Protection of Military Remains Act and granted. What we discovered as we started the excavation process and started recovering material was that potentially we had a different aircraft from the one we thought it was. We had two potentials. We had BV739, a Blackburn-built ferry that was delivered to Lyon Solent in July 1943 and then lost in September 1943 as it took off, reportedly 500 meters from the airfield. A second aircraft, LS473, was a ferry-built Mark II aircraft that failed to obtain climbing speed on takeoff on the 6th of January 1944 and crashed approximately 2 miles offshore based on the logbook of the pilot. However, as we recovered material, it became clear that actually the aircraft was probably LS473. And when we finally got the engine plate, and this was the details were sent off to the Rolls-Royce Museum, it was confirmed that it was very unlikely to be the Blackburn-built ferry due to the dates of the engine's construction and its delivery. So in the case of the Solent Barracuda, what we had was a low-impact ditching. Due to the missing elements, we weren't sure whether we had evidence of contemporary salvage, because the site is only about 8 meters deep, or whether what we were looking at was industrial impacts. The area is used for scallop dredging, and also in the past there's been oyster dredging there as well as fishing, or whether we were looking at illegal salvage. In the case of the illegal salvage, what we had was a diver's weight still lying close to the wreck, and items from within the wreck that were below the damage layer from the scallop dredgers, suggesting that people had removed things. The problem here was we also had archival data gaps in the identification of the aircraft, and certainly no squadron diaries or logs were available to be investigated. So the research was basically secondary resources. So what we did need was the archaeological curator's input when it came to the discussion on what we were going to do with the aircraft, and also the client involvement. Because of its location, the client was fairly open to a full recovery, and therefore the discussion with the curators was what were the potential options we could go for. They were very keen for us to have a museum for it to go to. Alternatively, it would go for disposal. What they were not happy about was the thought that we would go for a relocation. And so that was the decision made. However, following the conversation with the Fleet Air Arm Museum, they decided that they did want the entire aircraft, whereas when we first approached them, they were only interested in parts of it. As you can see, it doesn't look very impressive, but actually it's a substantially complete airframe. Because of its low impact ditching, very little of it was bent, and therefore parts of this aircraft were actually cleaned up and incorporated into a build project that they've got going on down at the museum to rebuild a ferry barracuda. So it was a good outcome. To give you an idea, there is a ferry barracuda as is of the type that was lost. It stands over 4.5 meters tall. It's got a wingspan of 14 meters. And as you can see, you can ship it in, basically fit what's left of an aeroplane into a shipping container when you've recovered it to the surface. It took 86 days of diving operations. There were a few mishaps, and the way it was recovered was by cutting it into pieces. So we cut off. So the first part was remove the damaged right wing, which was almost separated. They then cut through the engine bearers, remove that, remove the rear half of the fuselage, and then the rest was lifted in one piece. What I haven't mentioned, and this is the big consideration, I think, when you look back on recovery of aircraft, is the potential contamination risks. The amount of asbestos within the airframe was horrendous. And then combined with the radiological materials, there was a significant amount of material that had to be redeposited on the seabed in an archaeological exclusion zone as part of the project. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Alistair. I think it's really good to see an example of where we haven't just been able to avoid stuff and how we might manage it. So I think that's really useful.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions on the example or the approaches that Alistair was describing? Jeremy's asked a question on the chat. Oh yeah, but Graham's going to ask as well. I'll start off with this question from Jeremy, as I was going to start it, and then we'll move to Graham. But when does an aircraft become archaeologically significant? What period of time needs to pass? I don't think there's really a hard and fast rule, is there?
I don't think there's a hard rule at all on that. I think, no, I don't think there's a hard rule when it comes to archaeology. Archaeology is the study of the human past. So
I remember the example that I use for my finds protocol is my example of the supermarine attacker that was from the 1950s, and I always deliberately kind of use that one because it's from the 1950s. It kind of demonstrates that it's not doesn't just stop when World War II ends. Graham.
It's just a very quick observation, really, to add to something what Alistair's just said. I do a lot of this work, and I think the issue that we've got for offshore development is not so much aircraft discoveries per se and intact aircraft discoveries, it's dispersed aircraft crush sites that are occurring over quite extensive areas, because obviously aircraft can break up in the air. And that can potentially cause quite a lot of problems for developers because of the areas that are covered, particularly in terms of avoidance. And it's not also something that we're terrifically good at the moment in joining up the dots with to actually work out that we have a site of that type because of the way we investigate individual anomalies. Anyway, that's just an observation to add to what Alistair's just said.
Yeah, I think that's quite a key observation. It's kind of in my experience of reviewing significant amounts of ROV footage, for example, I don't think I've ever found an intact aircraft, but I've found plenty of bits of them, and actually being able to join them up and work out what they're from is always virtually impossible. So it would be, I think this is a key area of kind of research moving forward that perhaps we haven't quite got nailed yet. So I don't know if that's fair enough to say, but has anyone else got any questions for Alistair? Thomas.
Hiya. Just going back to the point around obviously the ethical human element. So I'm not that familiar with this area of work really, but what framework or what approach I can see somebody's put in about the Protection of Military Remains Act, but practically what approach would be taken in terms of thinking about, is it the right decision to be relocating, in terms of maybe it's still within living memory. So just curious to get your thoughts on that, really.
In terms of so you apply for a license under the Protection of Military Remains Act to carry out an excavation and recovery, and what you find is that they want you to identify the aircraft beforehand. So taking the Barracuda as the simplest example, we had to identify the aircraft type, and then we had to identify the specific aircraft. And so and unfortunately, this is where having a very good relationship with, the curators and the MOD, in our case, helped by the Ministry of Defence. Helped by Fleet Air Arm Museum's relationship they have with the Ministry of Defence, meant that when we basically went to the very patchy records that exist, and this is applicable all the way across, and funnily enough, Graham, where he's done research on American aircraft, would probably agree as well, large gaps. So you have to hope you've got the right aircraft if you haven't got anything obvious to identify it with. Ministry of Defence do allow you to do non-disturbance surveys, so you can investigate to a certain extent. And then you put in the license application. And in the case of the Barracuda, as we started to recover material, and it appeared that we didn't have the aircraft we'd assumed based on the available records. So, where it says it crashed 500 meters off the end of the airfield, we discounted the one where the pilot said I swam 2 miles ashore from my crashed aircraft. And then when it came down to it, actually what we had was the aircraft that in theory was 2 miles offshore, and we were missing somewhere out there one that had crashed within 500 meters of the airfield. But the conversation was had, and we could confirm that both aircraft had no casualties on, and therefore that it progressed, and we were able to carry on with the project. If there had been confirmed casualties, then National Grid were, as their contingency plan, were already gearing up for putting in for variations, and then putting in for a new license, and basically moving an entire cable route.
I've got time for one more question, George.
I was just gonna it's kind of a question off the back of that. So Vic and I have obviously worked on a few projects where we found aircraft remain. We found one recently where we found an aircraft that it was in such a bad state that no one could identify it, including aircraft experts. So what would the mechanism be there for obtaining a license if you can't actually identify the aircraft?
I think the
or is that
easiest,
just so niche?
Yes, I think you say it would be. I think for the most part we're lucky we can microsite.
Yeah,
and I think in terms of cost, that is the first avenue on any of this, microsite round it, just to avoid it, because once you start down that route, it starts to get very expensive for the developer.
Yeah.
And as I think for most of us, we're here as commercial archaeologists, therefore we have budgetary constraints placed on us.